Next up is someone I'm very excited to hear speak. Tashmia Bryant is a Senior Technical Assistant Specialist at the Center for Capacity Building at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. As a homelessness policy fan, I'm totally geeking out. The Alliance is a national nonprofit whose sole purpose is ending homelessness in the United States. Last year, the Alliance published a resource guide in collaboration with PetSmart Charities called Keeping People and Pets Together to support providers in homeless services to understand and meet the needs of this overlooked subpopulation. So about our speaker, prior to joining NAEH, Tashmia worked to develop and expand Connecticut's response to ending homelessness as the capacity builder and equity program manager for the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. She has also worked directly with at-risk families involved in the child welfare system, single adults, and youth. She's really done it all. Her keynote today is titled Unleashing Creative Strategies to End Homelessness for Pet Owners. And without further ado, let's welcome Tashmia Bryant. All yours.
Sorry about that, just getting oriented. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to My Dog is My Home for inviting me to this amazing conference. I'm so excited to be with you today and talking about how to address homelessness amongst people who have pets. As mentioned, I'll be referring to the Keeping People and Pets Together guide that we developed along with My Dog is My Home and a number of other community partners. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, create a little agenda. We'll go over effective emergency shelter, as well as what is an effective homeless response system. And I'll definitely tie it in so that you understand how it's relevant to what we're talking about today. We'll discuss housing first, being low barrier, and also the Keeping People and Pets Together guide. So the ultimate goal of ending homelessness is to get people housed. People are homeless until they are housed, whether they are in shelter, whether they're in, one of your housing programs, until they're actually in permanent housing, they are still homeless. So the goal is to quickly house people as quickly as possible and divert people from homelessness whenever possible so that they're not spending even one night homeless. To do this, it requires a systemic approach. All of the interventions, the resources, programs should be centered around this common goal of getting people housed as quickly as possible. So a lot of communities treat emergency shelter as that front door, as that, first interference or interfacing, that's what I mean, interface with people who are experiencing homelessness. A lot of communities do this. And so they're critical in ending homelessness. If they're going to be the front door, they are critical in ending homelessness. I have another screen. I'm not ignoring you guys. I'm just looking at some of my notes just so I can get as much important information to you as possible. And so I want to go over the 5 keys to effective emergency shelter. Housing first. We'll go a little bit more into housing first, as you saw was on the agenda, but just to briefly, give you a sense, housing first means that there are no prerequisites to housing. People, no matter what their situation is, no matter where they're coming from, who they are, considered for housing immediately without any prerequisites. Safe and appropriate diversion, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that if at all possible, if we can help someone avoid any experiences of homelessness, that is our goal. We want to make sure people are also not entering homelessness if we can do something about it. Immediate and low barrier access. So making sure that people have access to the services and support that we have available, making sure that they can get to us, making sure we can have those problem-solving conversations, that they can enter shelter if they need to, any programs or interventions or resources that we have available, we want to ensure that people can have access to those support and resources. And also just being housing focused and rapid exit centered. So if people do have to enter emergency shelter, just making sure that the ultimate goal from day one is housing, paying attention to what their needs are and aligning those with their housing goals. First, developing those housing goals with them, but then aligning everything with their housing goals and trying to quickly exit them from emergency shelter so that they can end their homelessness and be permanently housed. And then just to know that you're doing this quickly, just to know that you're, equitably serving everyone, is to measure that with data. So having those metrics, those data metrics that you are following along to ensure that, you're doing the best that you can. And with that is to have reliable data to ensure that the data that you're putting in, you can trust it and you can rely on it to tell the story of what is happening in your shelter. And also, I just want to mention, I linked at the very bottom, I linked to this 5 keys to effective emergency shelter, and I provided that link to My Dog is My Home as well. So you'll be able to, see this in further detail if you'd like. So as I mentioned earlier, shelters are important because when people are in housing crisis and you've done that problem solving and they truly have nowhere else to go, the shelter is that safe place or safe and decent place that they can go that is immediately available for them. So it will most likely sometimes be the only place that people can go. A lot of times people, when they're in housing crisis, that's the first thing they think of. They need shelter. Even if, after you do some problem solving, you find out that, they maybe could stay with a cousin or friend or even go back to where, whatever housing situation they came from. Shelter is usually the first thing that they think of. And so it's important to understand that as a system to be able to respond to people who are requesting shelter or coming to the shelter or calling the shelter, however your system is set up. And so it's important that, the shelter is aligned and has this common, goal and focus on what is their role and what exactly is the protocol and the policies and procedures to address people that they're interfacing with. And the goal is ultimately for the shelter to be integrated within the system, for there to be a process for accepting referrals, for there to be referrals outside of the shelter that are coordinated. And so that coordinated intake system is essential because you want to make sure that you're using the space, the resources accordingly and appropriately, and that again, that you're making sure that you're meeting the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness that are coming into your shelter. You want to make sure that you're diverting people who can safely maintain current housing, prioritizing shelter for those who need it most. Unfortunately, in many communities, there's not enough shelter. So using that problem solving to ensure that you're, meeting as many needs as possible, but also prioritizing those who do have to enter shelter to those who need it most. And I can go on that topic for a little bit longer, but I want to stay focused on the rest of the presentation. Again, immediate and low barrier access, no prerequisites for entry. And what we're all here to talk about is pets. So thinking about people who own animals, who, have these relationships with animals, especially if they've been experiencing homelessness for a long period of time with their animals and what that bond might mean to them. So being low barrier in that way, and also quickly connecting people to housing assistance and services that are tailored to their unique needs. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But in order to play a critical role, in order for shelter to matter, it needs to be accessible to people who need help. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be equitable so that it can effectively access and serve the people that need their help. As you can see from this poll that was done in collaboration with Oracle, one of the top reasons that people avoid shelters is that they don't accept their pet. So there are issues, and another one that can be related to this is that there are too many rules. Some of the rules may concern pets, may concern people who are coming in, and the fact that they have a pet, the fact that, something that concerns their pet, maybe the breed, maybe the, materials, or, items that the person has with them for the pet. So we don't want people turned away because they have a pet. And clearly there's some people who are avoiding shelter altogether and not engaging at all. So there's a population of folks who are not being served because they have a pet. So to be housing first, the ultimate focus that you should understand is that homelessness is a housing problem. People who are homeless need housing, and that's not necessarily anything else but housing. And so in thinking about housing first, realizing that there are resources, additional resources that people might need to help them sustain in housing, but that those are not a barrier to them obtaining housing. So no prerequisites, no programmatic prerequisites, thinking about policies, thinking about procedure, thinking about even intake, and what prerequisites, whether you realize it or not, are preventing people from accessing shelter. Also, trying to access and sustain permanent housing as quick as possible. So even when you think about low barrier, okay, people might have access, but how long does it take for the provider to have that housing conversation with that person, to be able to, start to develop their goals and the action steps of, helping that person to accomplish permanent housing. And also voluntary service participation. So yes, it'll be great for services to be available and accessible to people, such as sobriety, resources to help them obtain their sobriety, to help them with obtaining employment, to help them with getting connected to mental health resources. However, it's voluntary. So here's some examples of how you can put that philosophy into practice. So the idea that housing first is not a program, but is a system-wide orientation and response. So realizing that everyone is ready for housing, and that homelessness is a housing problem, and housing first means housing fast. And so to do that, think about no prerequisites. Think about how you can incorporate housing conversations, housing resources into, if we're talking about shelter, into their shelter practice, so that permanent housing is the ultimate focus and ultimate goal. And again, making services voluntary. Those are ways that you can put that into practice. Some questions that you might want to ask yourself is our mission reflective of this housing first philosophy? Is it low barrier? Does it reflect us being low barrier, accessible, and housing focused and housing first? What do policy and procedures say that help or hinder this transition? So taking that deep dive, keeping in mind accessibility, keeping in mind being trauma informed, and tailoring your policies and procedures to meet the housing first philosophy, thinking about prerequisites and requirements for entry into a program, or to get to a certain stage where housing is being addressed. What needs might need to be changed, or changes that might be, what changes might need to happen with regards to job roles and job descriptions. There can be a shift in what a case manager's duties are with regard to, instead of like compliance driven and behavior monitoring, it can be focused on housing, having housing conversations, a diversion specialist, and things along that line that signify and encompass the role of that person as being focused on housing. Also, what training is needed. So how to have housing conversations, how to develop those housing plans. When we're talking about, which we'll get to a little bit more deeper in the presentation, when we're talking about admitting people into shelter who have pets, when we're talking about outreach practices and being able to address the needs of people who have pets, what training might need to happen so that everyone is oriented towards this housing first, low barrier model. So I'm going to go over some important elements that are within the Keeping People and Pets Together guide. This is full of creative strategies that communities are using, have used, and for you all who have not started, will use to help address the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness, who have pets. Okay, so within this document, we discuss the human-animal bond, understanding the significance. Basically, why are we talking about this? And as we mentioned earlier, there are people who are not accessing services because they're afraid that they'll be separated from their animal, or because they were told that they cannot bring an animal in. So how can we design? It discusses how we can develop formal and system-wide strategies to collect data to understand how many people, have pets who are experiencing homelessness, what their needs might be, what the scale of the need might be. It's divided into three different categories, three different sections. So again, importance of those relationships between the homeless response system and animal welfare, the steps that provider agencies can take, the leadership that they can show in creating an agency-wide culture that is, effective in serving people who have pets, and also some recommendations for outreach worker, case managers, et cetera, on how to make sure that people experiencing homelessness are served adequately, who have pets, and also how can they access additional services. So I quickly just want to, before I close, just want to quickly go over some important steps that people can take. So first is to create a pet-friendly environment. So thinking about what supplies a person might need, training staff on animal behavior, how to, help in a situation where, someone might need assistance, where there's any, issues, danger, anything like that, or to be preventative in that sense. Also to develop meaningful and effective partnerships with animal welfare organizations. So helping to, creating those relationships where you can have the support to provide that training, to provide some of those needs that person might have in terms of leashes and cages, foods, water, et cetera, that the animal might need. Also, something I wanted to highlight is that some people who are experiencing homelessness may feed their animal before they themselves are fed. So ensuring that that pet has the needs, has what they need, is in some cases ensuring that the person who's experiencing homelessness has what they need as well. So yes, developing those relationships, learning about, local jurisdictions and, laws that may be applied, thinking about landlord needs, educating and training your staff, and again, just collecting and evaluating that data. Some special considerations you want to have are understanding human and animal behavior, as I mentioned, the food and supplies, the veterinary care, vaccines, documentation that a person might need if the pet needs to get registered in a certain town or for the state, making sure that those documentation is there, but then also with the ultimate goal of getting that person stabilized in housing, because some of those resources might be needed to ensure that that person can be housed sustainably. Here's my contact information. Again, I included the links to the resources that I mentioned, in the PowerPoint, which you all have been provided, as well as to My Dog Is My Home, who I believe has been sharing them with you throughout, in the materials and throughout the presentation. So I just want to thank you all. And I hope the rest of the conference is wonderful. I hope that you all utilize these resources to make sure that you're effectively serving people who are experiencing homelessness with pets. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This was really wonderful to hear. We have been circulating this resource guide since it's been written, and we really just love that, looking at Housing First, not as a program, but as a system response, and then including our companion animals as part of the family unit that shelter providers and housing providers like myself are addressing. So we have a few questions. What has been the response to the Keeping People and Pets Together resource guide? I mean, I know My Dog Is My Home, where you've been super excited, but what's in the feedback when you've been going to conferences and talking to other people?
People are actually excited because I think that communities were not, in many cases, were not serving this population or not accessing this population because there was a lack of knowledge. So this just provides a lack of knowledge. People are excited to be like, wow, this is something that I can do that I didn't even realize was an issue. These are partners that I can connect with that I never thought of as partners in ending homelessness. So I would say that the response has been, very warm and welcoming, and people will actually want more. This guide is like a start for them, but they want more information.
I love that you said shelters need to be accessible and equitable for those who need the help. Race equity has come up a lot throughout this conference, especially when we talk about cultural responses to pet ownership. We were able to see Stray, which is based in Istanbul. How can we as housing providers and even the animal welfare world be more equitable? Because there are, you go to certain neighborhoods and the breed restrictions, and I feel like there's just so much more to explore there. Wondering if any of that popped up while you were putting together this guide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think when it comes to creating those policies and procedures that we discussed, they help to be able to treat everyone equal. If we are following a certain protocol and we're treating everyone in a way where they have anyone, we're housing first, we're low barrier, everyone has access to these services. You're putting in some some barriers or kind of like guides, so that people aren't using their own kind of opinions and their own judgment to make decisions, because we know that implicit bias, leads people to discriminate. It leads people to be treated differently. And so in thinking about how you're putting together a pet-friendly program or shelter, whatever it is, being consistent and remembering that, when you kind of leave things up to people to decide, knowing what that comes with, that it comes with bias and that is systemically racist because of the white supremacist society that we are conditioned in. And so, I would just encourage people to also read up on their fair housing laws as well. Because when you're interacting with landlords, first, as shelter providers and housing providers, you have to follow fair housing as well. But also when you're coming into contact with landlords, certain questions they may ask you may be, against fair housing, may be considered discrimination. So just to have that information as you're approaching the situation, because that implicit bias can come into play, and you have to be ready to address that and identify that and prevent yourself from showing that.
That's really, really wonderful. So we have a lot of questions. If our community states they use the Housing First model, which people say they do it, but they don't, they just check that checkbox on that NOFA competition. What is the best way to communicate a desire to help them reduce that barrier that comes with pets? So how can they really implement Housing First when it comes to people with companion animals?
Sometimes it's black and white. Sometimes it really is black and white by putting in your policies that people with pets are, cannot be turned away from the door because of the fact that they have a pet. I think being intentional, very intentional and direct about what can and can't happen within your program is important. And also, with that though, supporting staff to be able to accommodate, people who have pets. So again, all the resources that we're talking about, connecting with the animal welfare agencies to ensure that, the support, the vaccinations, the training, things like that are there. You want to support that. But I think being very clear about what can and cannot happen and having that data to track it. If people are being turned away, knowing why are people being turned away, having that documentation. I think that is, very, very, very helpful. I think just being very intentional, because sometimes we get caught up in some of that wordplay and then, people are interpreting it in different ways.
Great. And you talk about, training staff and talking to them. Has there been any type of resistance from staff and leadership when you see sort of that integrating? Not everyone's an animal person. So, I mean, here at this conference, we're all like, yeah, sure, integrate. But some folks might have resistance to that.
Yeah, and that's very real. That's very real that some people may have allergies. Some people may be afraid and have trauma from, animals and pets. And I think that's where that training and that conversation, happens. Understanding that there are some very real concerns that people have and not dismissing that, just directly addressing that and understanding, how can we mitigate these in a way where we're still providing access to people and, meeting their needs, but also meeting the needs of our staff, of other guests that are in the shelter, especially when you think about, pets, but even like service animals, like there's a lot of protections around service animals, around emotional support animals, but they're still pets. So in the same way that you are, mitigating some of those concerns and addressing people who have, allergies, other disabilities that may, conflict or interfere with someone who has a pet, those are the same way, or has a service animal or emotional support. That's the same things that you can be doing to address people who, to help people who have pets and mitigate some of those issues, separating people, making sure that people have their own space, making sure the dog has or the animals has all the resources that they need to be, safe, and make sure everyone else is safe. I think a lot of those there has been pushback, but a lot of those same practices that have worked for service animals and for emotional support animals can also work for pets.
Really great. What pushed NAEH to really explore this intersectionality? What was it? People bringing this up to you guys, hearing it at conferences?
I think a lot of it was a combination of the fact of realizing that there are people who are not being served, who are dying on the streets because they are not accessing services because they, can't bring their pets, and they're like, well, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to give up my pet. So I think that inaccessibility drive, showed us that there was a need for something like this, but then also providers saying like, what do we do? What do we do in this situation? How can we, can you give us some information? How can we serve people who have pets, emotional support animals, and service animals, the whole gamut, how can we do this? Because we know that, people are not being served. So I think, on both ends, but ultimately our goal is to end homelessness, and it's not just for people without pets, it's for everyone. So I think that's what's driving us. We don't have no little asterisk under National Alliance to End Homelessness for people without pets. No, it's for everyone.
Love it. I love that. Do you have a sense of how widely pet-friendly policies that came about from this resource guide are being adopted? I know that in the chat we have a few shelters that are saying that they take animals, which is amazing. But I'd love to know how much this has expanded.
We have been hearing a lot from communities. We do a lot of work within, specifically, with the Center for Capacity Building, the work that we do in our team. We talk to communities all the time, whether we're doing, collaboratives, trainings, and this comes up, pets, animals comes up, and just hearing, that feedback that we're getting lets us know that it's being used in the community. I would say it's being used at all different levels, because some communities are still, trying to well, all communities are trying to enhance their coordinated access, networks, their systems. However, some communities are, trying to align their shelters in a way that are housing first and low barrier still, and be coordinated in the way that they do referrals and intake and, so on and so forth. So I would say it's being used in different, at different levels. I think, communities are just in different places, but we know that it's being used from the feedback that we get from communities and the types of questions that we get, like, okay, they must be reading the guide, or they must be trying to follow along with the guide, because the questions are very specific.
That's really, really great. You mentioned the OR code study, and about 22% said that they don't accept shelter because they can't bring their pets. What communities were part of the study? Was it national? Was it specific states?
This was before my time. I'm kind of new to National Alliance, but from what I understand, it was a national study that was put out around the time the guide was being either conceptualized or developed, around that time.
Great. And then our last question from Animal Welfare. How do we speak to this without coming off as trying to tell them what to do? So I guess, how do you start these conversations? Because I always say in the work that I do, it's like your people and my people, when we should talk about them being our people. And right. We know that sometimes there are silos. So how do you do that so that it's more of a collaboration instead of people being standoffish?
I really just realizing that your missions are aligned. Ultimately, your goals are the same. If an animal welfare organization is attempting to, work with the homeless response system, I think just putting that out in front in at the beginning of the conversation, that you all have the same goals. Also learning from each other. I think it's not just necessarily telling another organization or other system what to do. I think it's finding where some of those overlaps are, where some of the needs are that you can address, and vice versa, that they can address for you. And I think just that true partnership and approaching the situation with a sense of humility, that there's a lot that you can learn that you don't know. I think that's how you create that true partnership, and do it in a way where no one feels like any toes are being stepped on.
It's really great. Well, thank you so much. I could speak to you for hours. We really do appreciate this. And definitely, any shelters, human or animal shelters that are interested in learning more about co-sheltering, check out our co-sheltering collaborative on mydogismyhome.org. There's an amazing community of folks. Dana Teal manages these, and definitely encourage you. So Tashmia, thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. And this has been truly enlightening. And thank you to NAEH for everything they do towards our goal of ending homelessness.
Thank you. Bye.